Hey guys, and welcome back to Heart Breathings. We are moving on to the next video in the Preptober series as we get ready to write 50,000 words in the month of November. The process that I'm going to walk you through today is actually the process that I follow pretty much anytime I'm setting up a new novel to write, but I do tweak it a little bit for the speed that I'm trying to hit over the course of November. So I'm going to include basically the main part of my process as well as anything I do to make sure that I'm hitting those targets in the month of November, because it is writing faster than what I typically write. Now, before we get started, I do want to just go ahead and say here in the beginning that I am in no way saying that everybody should write their novel or plot their novel in this way. Instead, what I'm doing is offering you an inside look at my particular process, because I know when I was first getting started, one of the most useful things or helpful things for me was seeing and hearing about what other authors did, because we're not just born knowing the process that we personally need to follow to write a great novel. But the more you practice, the more you see what others are doing and try it for yourself, the more you're going to develop your own process. And that's really the point. There's no one size fits all or one way fits all for everyone to plot. And in fact, some people don't need to plot at all, and they really just want to have a very loose structure or a general idea of character. And that's totally fine. Everybody has a unique process that is going to really work for you. It is my hope that by seeing some of my process, it might spark some ideas for what you might want to try to help you win Nano this year. It will come as no surprise for those of you that know me well or have been following this channel for a while that I am a ridiculous organized plotter. I absolutely love to have as many details figured out as I can, and that's really what works for me. But you may find that you need a lot less planning than this, or you may find that you need to write even more details than what I'm doing. The main thing is to understand that the more prep work you can do on your actual novel before Nano begins, the better, because you don't want to get halfway through the month and have no clue or idea of what's going to happen next in your book, because you really don't have any days to waste when it comes to trying to write a novel this quickly. So I'm hoping that some of these tips will help you. I'm going to share my 7-step process for getting started with a new novel, and I hope you enjoy it. So let's get started. As my good friend Virginia Cantra always says, there are no rules with writing. There's only works or doesn't work. So for you, a essential part of the process is really just to figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. So I hope that seeing some of the behind the scenes of my 7-step process of how I map out my novel ahead of time will help you get some ideas going, and you can take from it what will work for you and just throw out the rest. So let me know in the comments for sure what you like and what you might try from this, or what is similar about your process to mine, because I would love to hear about it and maybe get some tips from you as well. Step 1, I gather all my tools and everything that I'm going to need. For me, this is typically going to be some kind of notebook. I have a specific old happy planner that I use for my plotting notebook, so I will pull this out. But of course, it could be any type of notebook you want to use that you can just keep your plotting notes in. I also will pull out index cards, markers in various colors, highlighters, pens. I prefer gel pens, but any type of pen will work. I also always print out my Plot Your Novel workbook. If you're brand new to the Heart Breathings community, I have an entire series here on YouTube about how to plot your novel, and that will go really well hand in hand with this Nano prep. So I'm going to link that for you down below. But when I created that series here on YouTube, I also kind of took my novel plotting process and put it into a free workbook that you can actually download anytime you sign up for my mailing list, as well as you can get the Preptober checklist that I talked about in last week's video. So all you have to do is click that link down below to head over to heartbreathings.com, sign up for my newsletter list, and I will send you a link to my entire resource library. But the first thing that I do when I'm setting up my novel for NaNoWriMo, or anytime I'm starting a new book, is I will print out that plotting workbook. And in fact, I will print it out for each one of my main point of view characters. For this year's Nano novel, I'm only going to have one POV character, so I'm just going to print it out one single time. But this plotting notebook has character sheets that help me figure out the character's motivation, goal, and conflict, as well as her backstory. And then there's basically an entire walkthrough of the entire 3-act structure. So I print this out, I get it all set up in my notebook, and that is step 1, all of those tools and getting them ready. Step number 2 is a major brainstorm session. So for this, I like to just take out a blank sheet of paper. Sometimes I will use my washi tapes and markers to kind of make it pretty, or stickers, just because I like it and it makes me feel excited to be writing it down. And I will basically go through everything that's in my head and put it down on paper. So hopefully, as you start getting ready for your novel, you've already been thinking about the story world, the characters, what type of conflict is going to be, what type of antagonist. If it's a book 2 or 3 or 10 in a series, then you probably also have a lot of story threads that are being carried over from the previous books. So I like to take sometimes maybe an hour or 2, but it depends on how many ideas I have ahead of time, and brainstorm and journal as much as I can think of about this story. And sometimes this is really just free writing stream of consciousness, and it will just be a brain dump of here's everything I can think of that might happen in the story that I know she's facing from book 1. Like I said, I'm actually going to be writing book 2 of a series, hopefully during the month of November. So when I'm pulling things from a previous series, sometimes I will actually start by reading through that previous book or the several previous books in the series so that I have a fresh idea of what those story threads are that are being carried through. And by story threads, I just mean any questions or lingering plot points that didn't quite get resolved in the previous books. Because when you're writing a series like this, I call it a dynamic series, there are going to be a lot of questions and things that have carried through from the previous books, maybe even an antagonist that's pulling through. And I want to get all of that on paper so that I get this sort of bird's eye view of what's happening in the book. Step number 3 is to really dive deep into my characters, particularly my main point of view character. Now, I have another series where I have 4 point of view characters, and so this part of the process takes me 4 times as long because I will go through each main point of view character and figure out some of the main points. Now, the main things I figure out about them are going to be usually their goal, motivation, and conflict for the outer part of the story, as well as their inner journey. If you have no idea what this is about, please go check out my previous series on how to plot a novel, because I go pretty much in depth about how to fill out this workbook and how to figure these things out about your characters. But basically, if you want to write a great story and you want that story to write as quickly and smoothly as possible, one of the keys is really understanding who your characters are and what their needs are, both the needs they're aware of and the needs and wants and desires they're not even aware, the things they don't even know they need. Also, how do they fit into the conflict? What are their powers, or why are they resistant to love? Depending on what genre you're writing, you're going to have different questions or things you want to know about these characters. But the more you can get to know them before you start writing, the better. The 3 main things that I always know about every character, obviously besides their name and their, appearance and things like that, is where are they both physically and emotionally at the beginning of the story? Where are they at the middle of the story, the midpoint or mirror moment of the story? And then where are they both mentally and emotionally, as well as physically, by the end of the story? So I want to know where they're going to be. What are the bookends? Where do they start? Where do they end? And that means not only physically how their world changes or where their location changes or anything like that, but also who have they become? Who have they transformed into? Because so much of the point of your novel is about that character transformation. So how far have they come by the end of this story? And if I can know that sort of triangle that James Scott Bell talks about in his book, Superstructure, or Start Your Story from the Middle, Write Your Story from the Middle, then I can get a pretty good idea of this character's journey. So that's step 3 for me, is always figuring out that triangle. Where are they at the beginning? Where are they by the midpoint? And then where are they at the end of that story? And that's going to go a long way to helping me figure out the rest of what happens in this novel. Step number 4, I brainstorm the major plot points. So I like to think of putting a plot together as putting a puzzle together. And I was always taught as a young girl that when you're going to put a puzzle together, you sort the pieces first, right? You find the four corners first and you put them on the board the way they should be arranged for those four main corners. Then you find all the edge pieces and you create the basic skeletal like square or rectangle of the puzzle. And you take all those middle pieces and you kind of move them to the side at the beginning. When I'm mapping out my novel, I'm basically doing that process with the story. So the first thing that I do after I've got the characters figured out is I find or figure out those four corners of my puzzle. What are the main like anchors of this story? So for me, it's actually kind of 5 things that I figure out. The first is, what's the hook or opening scene of the book? I like to be able to close my eyes and see it happening kind of like a movie. Where does the camera open on this character's world or this character and what's happening in their world? I like to start out in the middle of some kind of action or, where the story is really beginning for them. So that's the hook. That's the first thing. The second thing I figure out is, what's the first doorway of no return? What's the end of the Act 1 climax? Now, I go into this again in detail in my previous videos on how to plot a novel, so please go check those out if you would like a little bit more direction on how to map these things out. But basically, I follow a 3-act structure, which in essence becomes 4 pieces of a story. You have Act 1, then you have Act 2, Part 1, or the first half. You have the second half of Act 2, or Act 2, Part 2. And then you have Act 3. So it kind of becomes 4 pieces of your novel. And there is basically a climax to each one of those pieces. So I always figure out that first opening scene. That's the hook, or the disturbance, or the opening scene. Then I figure out that Act 1 climax, which becomes kind of the first cornerstone of my story, the first big twist or plot point that really locks that character into the main action of the story. And this is always going to be a moment, or usually going to be a moment in the story, where everything changes for your character and they have to react in such a way to the events of this climax that it changes their world or their lives forever. So I try to figure out that first doorway of no return. After this point, there's no going back to the old way of life for your character. They have to pass through this doorway into the main part of the story. Then the third thing I figure out is, where's that midpoint? So at the first half of Act 2, at the climax of that act, you're going to have another major twist or turning point in your story. And I always mark this midpoint with a note that says, this changes everything. Because the midpoint of the story, which happens, obviously around the middle of your story in terms of word count, is going to be another moment that changes your character's world. It's going to be some kind of major revelation. It could be a death of someone they loved, or what Alexandra Sokolov calls a now it's personal moment. It could be the first time your character falls in love or has sex. It could be lots of those different types of things. And if you want some really great examples of what might happen in each one of these acts in terms of scenes that you might find or different types of turning points, I cannot recommend her book highly enough. So it's Alexandra Sokolov's Screenwriting Tricks for Authors. She gives lots of ideas of different types of scenes that you'll find at each of these turning points. So I figure out that midpoint, and along with that usually comes a point called the mirror moment that I was just talking about earlier from James Scott Bell's books Superstructure and Write Your Story from the Middle. So this is a more internal beat. So the midpoint itself will usually be something external, and then somewhere around that period of time, there will also be a mirror moment where your character kind of figuratively looks in a mirror and thinks, who have I become? If I don't change, that's where the transformation comes in, then I'm going to die. And that death can be literal or figurative, or it can be, emotional death or psychological. It doesn't have to actually be that they die, but sometimes it could be that they're afraid they're going to die. So for more information on that, go watch my previous videos or read James Scott Bell's book. But I like to have those kind of 2 things figured out right there in the middle, the midpoint and the mirror moment. Then the fourth one that I like to have figured out is kind of the second doorway or the black moment. Sometimes because this is really getting deep into the story, I don't always have as many details or as clear of an image in my mind of what exactly this second doorway of no return is going to be, or this Act 2 climax. And I might not be able to see the exact black moment, but I like to at least sketch out some ideas of like, what's the worst possible thing that can happen in my character's world? What's the main part of like what we can take away from them, or what's their worst fear? And sometimes I will actually, even if I'm struggling to figure out these plot points, I will actually sit down and create a like worst case scenario list, which is going to be at least 5 things that are like, what's the worst thing that can happen to this character? And what would just make her life terrible? Because part of your job as an author is to add that conflict in and kind of to torture your characters a little bit. So I like to make this list, and sometimes that will spark ideas of what might happen at these different plot points, because the stakes and what your character is going through should escalate throughout the novel. Then the fifth and final thing I like to have figured out for my like corners of my puzzle is, what is the climax? What's this whole story heading to? When it all comes to a head at the end, what is going to happen? And the type of climax that you'll have in your story is going to be very specific to the type of genre that you're writing. If you're writing a romance, then that climax is going to be the moment where they, face their fears, their inner demons, and they finally confess. There'll be that moment of like, I love you and I'm standing up for you and I'm going to be there for you forever. In most of my novels, the climax is going to be an actual like face off with whoever the antagonist is. So it's going to be some kind of battle scene where my heroine is going to have to like fight for her life. And that's usually the type of climaxes that I will create. But that's going to be basically what your whole story is hurtling towards from the very beginning. And this is what we've headed toward, the moment where it all comes to a head and it's do or die at this point. So I like to know those 5 things: hook, first doorway, midpoint, second doorway or black moment, and what's that climax moment, the climactic moment. Some of these things might change as I start writing, and I stay really flexible about it, but I like to know where those 4 corners of the puzzle are, where the opening and then those 4 corners, because it creates a structure that allows my imagination to start really going wild, but within some boundaries. The 5th step that I do is a little bit extra, I will admit, but this is creating a word count map or a set of word count targets for myself. So the way that I calculate this is I take an estimate of how many words I think this novel will be total. Now, of course, in the month of November, we're trying to write 50,000 words. You could go over that if you want, but the goal is to write at least 50,000 words. For me, 50,000 words is not going to get me to the end of this novel, but it'll get me a good way in. If you have literally no idea how many words total your book is going to be, you can totally skip this step 100%, and that's fine. But if you have a pretty good estimate of how many total words you're going to have, let me show you how I use this and why it's useful for me. So I am estimating my word count for my Nano novel to be about 70,000 words. Now, I'm only going to plan to write 50,000 in the month of November, but I do know that I estimate the whole novel will be about 70,000 words. So then what I do is I take that full word count, 70,000, and I divide it by 8. Now I'm using the 8 because remember how I told you I had 4 main segments to my novel: Act 1, Act 2, Part 1, Part 2, and then Act 3. So I've got those 4 main sections. Well, I take them and I divide them again, because I always think of pacing in terms of my novel to not be like one long slog to the end of Act 1 and then one long slog to the end of Act 2. I kind of think that I want to have some kind of action or pinch point or moment in each story that happens about halfway through Act 1 and then at the end of Act 1. So it's kind of like a mini climax and a climax. Then again, about halfway through the first half of Act 2, I'm going to have another mini climax. So that creates sort of like 8 equal-ish segments. It doesn't have to be exact, but it gives me a target to aim for. So I'll take that 70,000 words and I'll divide it by 8, which gives me 8,750 words per segment. So I will take that and use that figure to figure out my word count target for the mini climax of Act 1 and then the first doorway of no return, which should happen somewhere around or about 17,500 words. Then I will use it to also calculate the mini climax in the first half of Act 2, as well as the midpoint of the novel, which should be happening somewhere around 35,000 words or halfway through the book, and so on. So I will figure out these 8 word count targets. Now, there are a couple of different reasons why I do this. First is because when I'm trying to write quickly and I'm just figuring out my scenes list and everything else that's happening, it's just good for me to have a general idea of how many scenes I'm going to need to get through that word count, or how many words I have to work with, so to speak. So this is kind of a planning tool for me. And again, this is something maybe for a more experienced writer who understands like about on average how long is each scene that you're going to write, or if you know you've got a particular scene, you can kind of estimate based on your experience how many words that scene will be. So again, if this is a little bit more advanced for you, don't worry about it. It's not necessary. Also, I apologize for the screaming happening. My husband's getting dinner ready out there, so it's a little bit noisy. Step number 6, after I have those word count targets, now I get into the real meat of planning or mapping out my novel. In this section, what I do is I create scene cards or index cards for the entire novel. This is where I totally geek out over organization and index cards and color coding and all of those types of things. So if you guys would like to see a more detailed video on how I create these scene cards or these index cards, I will be more than happy to oblige. So make sure that you subscribe, hit the like button, and comment down below to let me know that yes, you do want to see an entire video on scene cards. For now, I'm just going to give you a brief overview. What I do is I just start out with a rough estimate of about 8 scenes per act or per piece of an act. So I start out by creating on just a blank white note card an Act 1 header card. And then I will count out about 8 to 10 white blank cards to go behind it. I'll do the same for Act 2, Part 1, Part 2, and for Act 3. So I will do this for each of my 4 main parts of the story. For this part, I do actually like to be able to spread out a little bit. So you can see here, I'm working on my kitchen table, but sometimes I will do this on the floor or on the bed or some place where I have a lot of space to kind of play around with. But what I'm doing here with these scene cards is basically creating a roadmap for my character's journey through the story. So I will place the Act 1 header card at the top and then fan out those 8 to 10 scene cards underneath. Then I will go to the top again, just like in my 4-part column that's in my plotting notebook. I will kind of recreate that grid on the table or floor in front of me. The next step is to actually go through those plot points that I already figured out earlier in the process. So I will take the very first index card underneath Act 1 and I will put as many details as I can about that hook or opening scene that I already figured out earlier. Then I'll skip all the way down to the end of Act 1 for that first doorway. So this is the Act 1 climax, the first doorway of no return. What's the main thing that happens here and how does it affect my character? What choice does she have to make? What's her reaction to it? What is the inciting or what's the key event that locks her into the story here? And I will write as much detail onto this note card as I can for now. I don't have to have everything figured out, but the more I can write here, the better off I'm going to be. Then I will go through and do that for every scene that I already know, which at this point is usually that first scene and then each of the climaxes of every additional act. Then this is where the tough work comes in. And this is where you have to just kind of let your imagination go. One of the things that helps me most with this is I will imagine in my head, I will close my eyes and imagine that first act opening scene. And then I will think, okay, my character has to go from here to that first doorway? How do I get her from where she is now? What all needs to happen sequentially to get her to this moment of the first doorway of no return? Who does she need to meet? What skills does she need to take on? Does she need to get introduced to the world? Does she need to discover her magic for the first time? And I will just start brainstorming any little scenes that might come up. If it's a scene that I know, okay, I can see this. She's got to meet the hero. She's going to go to school for the first time at this new school, and she's going to meet this guy at school. I can write that down on a scene card and place it on, a guess of where I think it's going to occur in Act 1. If it's something I'm kind of thinking about, but I'm not sure where it occurs in the story, like, okay, at some point she needs to learn how to use a katana, or at some point she's going to create a spell that can bring back her memories. I may not know where that occurs. I may not even understand which act it occurs in. So I can create the note card and kind of put it in a placeholder. But another thing I like to do is take Post-it notes. So sometimes when I'm trying to use it on, if I have a big wall set up, I will use sort of these medium-sized Post-it notes. Sometimes if I'm setting it up on just my small plotting notebook, I will use those tiny little Post-it page flags. And these are just easy to move around. They're Post-its, right? They're movable. So I will place an idea of that scene, like Parrish learns to use her sword here, just anywhere where I think it might fit. And I will play around with those scenes and those ideas and move them around until it seems like they make sense. When I feel like I know for sure where it's going to go, then it'll get its own scene card and it'll go into the mix where I think it's going to go. I will try my best to fill out as many of these scene cards as I can before November begins. Then when I'm ready, I will place those cards in sequential order. I will put them in a little alligator clip or whatever, and I will keep those on my desk. This creation of the scene cards is one of the most pivotal points of my Nano prep, because I will now be able to approach each day throughout the month of November with a pretty clear idea of what I'm writing. So I can't get lost. I can't really get stuck. I just look at the note card and I know what scene I'm writing and I get to work. Now, of course, this is always going to change and shift a little bit, and new ideas will come to me as I'm writing, but this makes me feel a little bit of power and control and confidence as I get ready to write. The seventh and final step is one that kind of combines those last two, and again, is a little bit extra and a little bit advanced, but I wanted to mention it here because it's something that I like to do when I'm plotting out my targets for Nano. So like I said, this isn't something I do normally, but it is something I do specifically for the month of November to try to hit these word count targets. So basically what I do is I take that word count map that I created. So let's say I know I've got to hit 17,500 words to get to the end of Act 1 of my story. If I am aiming for those 1667 words that they give us as a daily target for NaNoWriMo, then I know that I should be hitting the end of Act 1 somewhere at the beginning or halfway through day 11 of my writing, and having that basic target. So now I know I should hit my, first sort of mini climax. I should be hitting that by day 5 or 6. So if I'm way behind or way ahead, that kind of lets me know like if the story is actually going the way I expected, and it gives me a basic target to aim for. So remember how I said for this novel, it's 70,000 words. So halfway through, or that midpoint, I should hit it around 35,000 words in terms of my word count. Well, when I look at my chart for my daily targets for NaNoWriMo, I know that that means I should hit the midpoint of my novel somewhere around day 21 of writing. So it allows me to kind of get an idea of my entire strategy and when I should be hitting those word count targets. Again, totally extra and unnecessary, but for me, it helps me keep on track with my pacing, with my energy and my momentum. And in a way, it kind of gamifies the whole thing for me and lets me have that, okay, I got to get to the midpoint today. It's day 21. And I just like the way that feels. Okay, so that is basically the entire process of how I map out my novel for NaNoWriMo. If you want more information on all of those different plot points and what should happen in the story, please go check out my video series on how to plot a novel. Sign up for my newsletter list where you will get access to my Preptober checklist, as well as my word count trackers and my entire How to Plot a Novel workbook that you saw me using in this video. If you want to see more detailed scene lists or how I create those scene cards, please go ahead and comment below. I would love to have you as part of my Heart Breathings community, so hit that subscribe button, like this video, and comment down below, and I will see you guys for more Preptober goodness throughout the rest of this month. Bye.